Hey everyone, I'm Temporal, and I will be starting a new channel here where we're going to be thinking about Overwatch. Specifically, I want to look a little more at organized play, meaning what happens in scrims, pro play, those good games, as opposed to the nonsense that we all have to deal with on ladder. I will be digging behind the scenes into what happens in scrims and such, and as such, footage sometimes will be a bit more limited, as common courtesy. Teams are generally not going to share scrim footage, even though I have plenty of it. It's not something I can share out with everyone, as the opposing teams would quite reasonably get upset about that. So sometimes when I'm going over in pro play and such, I'll have good things to reference. Other times we're going to have to work with what we have here. But we'll overcome those limitations. So today what I really want to start with and focus on is why we have the meta we do, kind of how we got here, what happened. So as most of us are probably aware, since about season 3, we were in a dive meta. We went dive seasons 4 through 9, dive all the way. We had variants of dive. Sometimes Sombra was in flavor, sometimes Genji, sometimes Soldier, sometimes no diva, triple DPS. But in one form or another, dive was generally how the game was thought of up until the release of this here, right here, Brigs. And Brigs had a really interesting effect on the game. It's very clear that she was released very much with the intent of being a meta breaker. From the get-go, it was actually a bit ridiculous quite how powerful she was. She was released with Bash on a nice 5-second cooldown right there. She was released with Whip Shot on its 4-second cooldown there that would act as a knockback, and then Repair Pack, which, let me go ahead and find a quick target here for you, which, you know, had its own, 6-second cooldown there. So we're looking at a 4, 6, and 5-second cooldown on release for this hero. And why she was able to shut down dive so well, even from a theoretical standpoint, was that Bash was a stun, right? And we all know her as the Tracer Eraser, the combo of, okay, if I bash Tracer, then immediately hit her with a whip, with a swing of the flail, and then whip shot, she dies before she can recall. That really wasn't the primary reason she stopped dives, though. What she really did to stop a dive is she had the ability to whip shot back a Winston as he came in, stun a D.Va as she came in with Matrix and Micro Missiles, and then still turn and use her armor pack on the squishy that was being dove by the remaining 2 DPS there. And as you know, that armor pack gives armor. Dive DPS sadly aren't very good at chipping away armor, so that's no bueno for them. Obviously, she still does have 5 teammates. Very easy to defeat the dive at that point. No Matrix in play for a full second. Means things like flashbangs, grenades can come out without fear of getting countered. You can even sneak up some ults there when those are in play. No real fear, and it very much killed dive, at least for a tiny window. And that window was smaller than I think most of you probably realize if you aren't playing in the organized scene. So we have that. Brigs is released, and meta has to pretty much immediately shift hard from dive to something else. And that's something else. There's a brief window where it uses Junkrat, but Junkrat got hit with nerfs too, to his rip tire speed and projectile size, etc. So really what the meta pretty quickly settled on was a composition that featured Reinhardt, Zarya, then Mercy, Briggs, Hanzo. So that was our 3-2-1 composition with Hanzo. Obviously it took advantage of those Grav Dragons, and that was in play for much of Season 10. As the season went on a little bit, and people realized, hey, we can drop out Briggs and put in Widowmaker because it's so easy for our Widow to just swap back to Briggs if the other team goes dive. Totally wrecks their ult economy, whereas we just had to swap one hero. They can't really play dive into us. That's what it looked like on ladder. Like I said, ladder isn't my big focus. I'm just giving a reference point so you guys understand where we are in our timeline now. And what we got over to was, in organized play, we had that 3-2-1 comp. But teams more quickly saw one of two things. Either they went, this is awful, how do we break this 3-2-1 comp, how do we cancel it? And primarily that means how do we make these gravitons not get value, because if you get grav, mercy boosted grav dragon, that's no fun. And how do we find some way to deal with the fact that Briggs just disrupts everything if we try to do a dive. The dive doesn't get that first initial kill, doesn't force out cooldowns the right way. A dive is doomed to fail if a dive happens against Briggs when she has all of her cooldowns and none of her teammates are dead. She's just too good at countering the heroes that are involved in it. So what happened is either teams built anti-Briggs comps, so compositions that were specifically designed to punish teams that were using Briggs, or a little more time passed and teams saw goats. Goats was making a splash at this point in time. They'd come through with their placing in the Beat tournament, I believe was the first one, where they won through from the lower bracket and just won everything. And they did it off the back of the comp that was eventually named after them, the Rein, Zarya, Diva, Briggs, Moira, Lucio comp that would just effectively run over things. Find the least mobile target, speed boost onto it as a group, super pocket your Reinhardt and Zarya, and let them carry. It's a good comp, don't get me wrong. Like, it's a powerful comp, and it is hard to deal with. You can't just run a certain composition to counter it. You have to change your play style. Eventually, however, if teams hadn't already built their anti-Briggs comp, they saw this GOATS comp, and they either went, okay, well, we have to run that because that's the meta now. Hell, it even ran over Fusion University, who had won the previous season's Contenders title in North America, and GOATS wasn't even in Contenders. Little did we know they wouldn't even make the next season of Contenders at that point. They would burn out in Trials as their comp got exposed. But ultimately, their comp did get exposed. NRG showed the world how to defeat the GOATS composition and the GOATS style of play just about 3 weeks later, I want to say, in the Overwatch Pit tournament. And then for any teams that were organized teams playing, scrimming, playing in tournaments, they got to see that NRG was showing how to beat up the GOATS comp. And a couple weeks after that, in case anyone had still missed it or saw what NRG had done to GOATS but didn't quite understand it, Silence released an article. Silence later went on to become one of the coaches for the LNL Contenders team, but Silence released a nice 30-page article on how to beat GOATS. Ultimately, the gist of it, what my team had been doing for a while, actually we were laughing as GOATS was running through because we're like, hey, we can beat that comp. We've been beating that comp for ages. It's vulnerable to all of the same things that the Hanzo 3-2-1 comp is. And what that is, for any of you that haven't read that article, is it loses to super poke comps. When you're wanting to take down any sort of composition that is heavily reliant on running tanks like that, obviously their range is very limited. They have pretty much none of it. Diva is the only one who can leave the comp and not instantly get murdered. So what you do is you can run double snipers at them, you can run Hanzo Pharah at them, you can run Pharah plus a flanker at them, but the concept behind it is you refuse to take the engagement, even letting them begin to cap a point. If you can dance your tanks on and off the point to prevent a tick, great, but that is high risk, of course, as they can be stunned by Briggs's bash and then punished by the rest of the team. So if you have to give up a tick, that's perfectly acceptable. If you have to give up some cart distance, do it. But in doing so, you allow your superior poke to wear down their resources. They run through their shield, their defense matrix, their Moira P, whatever you want to do there. They start running out of resources, and eventually they can't keep up, and your spam either finds a pick, or they get so low on resources that your team just commits to the dive. And yes, I did say dive. Ladder liked its double sniper Rein Zarya composition. That is strictly worse than running double sniper with dive tanks or Hanzo Pharah with dive tanks. What you run into there is much better options for finishing off targets. You force a Moira fade, get a Moira low health, dive it, you exhaust the resources, and then once they're truly at their lowest, your tanks go in and win the fight. Plus having those dive tanks means that you don't just lose to grab, which at the time you did because Grav is powerful. You know, Grav's powerful ult, and you don't just lose to it because you can eat it, which is obviously nice, and you're super spread out on high ground. So even if the Goats comp gets a Grav, this is the real key here, I should have gone into this first. When you're playing these super poke comps, you're positioning around high ground, making sure that they can't get on any of your team members. You take away their option to dive onto any of your heroes. You don't run any stationary heroes like a Reinhardt or a Zarya, except maybe a Zen. And if you run that Zen, you keep that Zen on high ground where they can't get to him, and that Zen preemptively rotates anytime they even look like they're going to go after him. This means that instead of being able to just run over your team, they have to camp the point to try and force you to go there. That's obviously fine. You do that. If you have to give them the tick or a little cart distance, so be it. Once you've worn them out, you just go win the fight. If you don't wear them out successfully enough, or if ults come online, you just get to kill them with Missile Barrage, Dragon. Dragon's a little less good for killing them then. Dragon's great for killing them on repushes, which is exactly what happens. Your team wins with Missile Barrage, you matrix your own Missile Barrage. Goats has no answer besides their own diva, who's exhausted at this point, as you've been spamming them for quite a while, doesn't have the matrix to block out a reasonable portion of your barrage. Kill 2 or 3 of them with it, you just win. You then have other ults for the next push. It's very easy to split a Goats team and do significant damage to it as it's pushing in with a Dragon Strike, even if it doesn't have any sort of Grav to support it. The Grav is unnecessary against Goats because of how Goats paths. You get to clean that up using often just that ult, and then what do you know? Suddenly you're very close to Barrage again, because Goats feed so much ult charge by nature of that having 3 tanks there. So very easy to, once you break Goats once, keep beating it as long as you rotate through your ult economy there. But winning that first fight can be challenging. Your team does have to respect the space available, give them space, potentially give up tick distance, etc. Make sure that no one gets over eager and engages too early. I did talk here heavily about beating Goats with a more spammy style. I think that is the higher probability of defeating Goats than the other options. As I mentioned earlier, you can use a style that would be more of a Pharmacy Tracer, Pharmacy Sombra type thing, where you try to force out the fade and then have the Tracer immediately dive in and kill the Moira, and then you take the fight. You can do something like that. Still, you know, a little scary to play into the Brigs, but absolutely doable. And then the most popular, of course, was the double sniper composition, where you're not trying to wear down resources anymore. You're strictly hunting for picks. Your Widow and Hanzo are spreading out, taking opposite sight lines, just like your Hanzo and Pharah were taking opposite sight lines, and simply fishing for those picks on the Moira, the Lucio, the Brigs if necessary, understanding that shooting the tanks really isn't going to do much there, and you're strictly fishing to get that kill there. So that happened. That was Goats. Like I said, the scene figured out how to deal with that. The latter never really did. I mean, they kind of got it, but it really requires a little too much discipline from the rest of the team who aren't the DPS to not engage while the DPS fish for picks, exhaust resources, whatever their solution is going to be there. And it really requires the DPS to understand how to ration out their ults, never to over ult once you've won that first fight, so that you can continue to make the comp ineffective. As well as the DPS being on the same page for what their objective is. Exhaust resources or pick a Moira off. Anyway, a little more tangent, a little more explanation of how to counter Goats than I perhaps needed to go into there, but you guys all get it. It's a powerful comp. It's still a very relevant comp in the meta, so I don't think that really hurts anything. What we ran into after that was, as these teams came up with their counter Goat strats that worked, well, that gave teams permission to play dive again. If you can force Brigs out or force a Brigs comp to lose, you get to swap back to everyone's that's definitely not everyone's favorite hero. You get to swap back to everyone's favorite heroes. Bring out the Tracer, the Winston, the Diva. Yeah, those are fun heroes. We get to play those heroes, and they're fun, and everyone likes playing them. No real problem there, etc. So that happened for a while, But it didn't ever fully happen. And the reason it didn't ever fully swap off of goats to dive, no, I don't want to talk about the reason it didn't fully swap back. I want to point out that even though I just talked through, okay, energy showed the world how to counter goats for anyone that didn't already know, teams continued to polish and work on goats because goats is an effective comp and goats got hard to beat. We started seeing goats variations. Maybe you swap out your Briggs, your Diva, or your Zarya for a McCree, a Widowmaker, a Sombra, a Hanzo, a Doomfist, something along those lines. You start making adaptations to beat specific other comps. I'd say the most important adaptation that showed up was probably swapping Moira for Ana. Swapping Moira for Ana had the very interesting effect of taking away the ability of super poke comps that weren't pickoff based, but were instead exhaust the opposing team style. Well, you can't do it as much. Ana doesn't run out of healing darts the same way Moira runs out of P. So now exhausting them only really starts getting through shielding and matrix, and that's significant, but it's not as significant when you're not running Moira out of her healing resource there. So Ana goats can be played into comps that are meant to exhaust, so more like a Junkrat comp if you were to use him. He's terrible for countering goats. Let me rephrase that. Junkrat is fine for countering goats, but he's not a safe pick to use because he's going to be garbage into any comp that doesn't use more than 2 tanks. And you can't blind open that. You need a composition that you can blind defend against goats for Hanamura A, Hollywood A, those points where you can really get hit by goats. You need to be able to defend against it. And a hero like Junkrat doesn't do that when he loses to everything else. Pharah, Hanzo, Widow, those were all fine heroes. Widow less on Hollywood A, but you guys get the idea. So that's good. Now what we've got to deal with is the situation of we have some teams running goats, and not just bad teams. I want to point out that this goats thing lasted in part. Well, no, let's back up a bit here. Goats hung around in some form pretty much until today. We still see some form of goats, but we did see goats fade. As I said, everyone figured out how to counter it in organized play. Some teams still scrimmed it heavily. Contenders EU really like their tank play. They have a history of really liking their tank play. But goats was somewhat figured out. Double Sniper could handle goats. You could handle goats with the overpowered Hanzo and Pharah. You could handle goats. Then we had another patch come along, and this patch was super interesting. We first had our Symmetra Teleporter patch. That's potentially meaningful, and I'll get into that later, but that didn't really shake up organized play very much, or at least initially. I think it will in the future, and I'll get into that. But what we saw is the patch landed that was the support readjustment and sniper mobility nerf. So Hanzo got some time added to his leap cooldown, Widow got some time added to her grapple cooldown. Briggs saw her second 1 second nerf onto Bash, so she's finally in a place where she can be punished for having that on cooldown, for using that wrong, and it's a real window for punishment. But Moira and Lucio both got buffs, and as you are all aware, that's important because Moira and Lucio are both mostly, particularly Lucio, staples in goats and the goat variant comps. So we got an additional 2 meters on Lucio's aura, speed or healing, and we got 20% faster passive regen for Moira's healing. Lucio also got a sound barrier buff. That sound barrier buff meant it got more maximum HP. I believe it went up from 500 to 750, how much it gives. Decays to 0 in the same amount of time that the original sound barrier did, though. So same maximum health, decays down to 0 in the same total amount of time, though. I'd really say that's less important. In theory, that makes it better, makes it a little more forgiving for countering some things like self-destruct, Junkrat tire, etc. Truth is, it wasn't used super frequently to cancel those ults. But anyway, the big one I'd say is the Lucio one, and the Moira one matters. Add in sniper mobility nerfs when at least one sniper was used in pretty much every composition that countered goats, and suddenly it looks like Blizzard has released a goats patch This is a patch where Goats is just going to run wild. Obviously, when I say Goats, I'm perfectly fine with the variant comps. It doesn't strictly need to be 3 tanks and 3 supports. It does, however, need to be either 3 tanks or 3 supports for me to consider it a Goats comp. If you're running a 2-2-2 Death Ball, that is a Death Ball, which, by the way, you shouldn't. Death Ball, the 2-2-2 style, is dead, is bad, has not been good for a long time. If you want to do organized play, and even on ladder, you really shouldn't be playing Death Ball, but in organized play, the ways to play this game right now, as I mentioned earlier, are Dive, Goats, and Warp Bunker. Yes. So, what we're looking at here is Blizzard released a Goat super patch. So, sure looks like Goat should be played again. Organized play scene somewhat responded to this. Obviously, we saw Europe continued to do tanks. That doesn't really mean anything. But we saw contenders playoffs continue to come out pretty heavily, including South America and Korea. Goats was the answer. The World Cup stages, yeah, they liked Goats. We saw that both at the first 2 World Cup stages. We saw quite a bit of Goats. So nothing too surprising there. It's a Goats comp. What are you going to do? That's fine. Whatever. But it wasn't fully a Goats comp. It wasn't fully a Goats patch. Let me rephrase that. It was a Goats patch. That patch made Goats better. It did. There's no denying that patch made Goats better. What it didn't do, though, is make Goats the alpha comp. Dive still beat Goats. And the way that happened, this time, they took away our snipers, they took away Dive's ability to just spam them out, etc. But metas sometimes are adjusted by patches, and metas sometimes evolve naturally as experimentation happens. As coaches go, hey, team, I want you to do this, this, and this. Hey, team, I think this is going to work really well. That's what we do. That's how we get places. So the meta did its natural evolution and realized, hey, Doomfist is really good for beating up tanks. The only tank that has a favorable matchup against Doomfist is Roadhog, and Roadhog hasn't seen play in ages. He showed up in Slambulance, but Slambulance never really took over. It wasn't a powerful enough comp. It wasn't until Brigs took his spot in Slambulance, making it Goats, that, tanks really became a common play style outside of Europe. So the meta evolved, and Doomfist was the solution, and also reworked Sombra had been out for a little bit now. People had experimented with her a little bit, and we'd realized, hey, perfect scouting, which is what Sombra gives us, is really good. You get to set up amazing dives, you know where everyone is, you don't have to trade as much tank HP or matrix or cooldowns for figuring out where people are. You get to just, for free, go check with Sombra. And also, you can start 2/3, 3/4 of your fights, something along those lines, depending on if you properly manipulate vision with the rest of your team, with a free hack on a target. That's great. So there we are. Dive comps have evolved. Dive comps have figured out, hey, if we mix in Doomfist or Sombra, we can do this. Sombra's really good against tanks. Doomfist is really good against tanks. If you use either one of them, your dive can suddenly beat the Goats comp again. Sombra-based comps tend to do it a little more by farming ults, and what I mean by that is, like we talked about previously, the super poke comp, one of your win conditions is you farm up missile barrage and you just win. Well, you can do the same thing easier now with Sombra, because she hacks out a D.Va, no Matrix, or a Rein, no Barrier, and she gives her partner DPS, as well as herself, a nice little window to farm ult charge. So maybe she does what she did with Fusion University, where they came out with that in the playoff bracket for Contenders Season 2 and went, hey, let's run our Genji Sombra comp, because we're just going to roll you over, Nanoblade one fight, EMP the next, and repeat ad nauseum. That works fantastic. That's one way to beat Goats, right back on the table. Doesn't matter that we've strengthened the supports in this case. The other way to beat Goats is, of course, Doomfist, like I mentioned, has really favorable matchups against tank comps, against tanks in general, and no one in a Goats comp does anything against Doomfist. I mean, Briggs can hit a bash, yes, but Doomfist can punch her from out of bash range. Doomfist can come in at so many angles. Obviously, teams do get better at predicting his rollouts, where he's going to come in from, etc., but he's not acting alone. He does have a team, of course, around him that's helping provide those windows, making that easier, and short of hitting that bash, tank comps really don't have a way to punish him. So, we're kind of back to dive can beat goats. Now, I'm not going to lie, we are in a place where goats is still very effective, but dive is king. Dive, when executed properly, when no one messes up, is going to, at the highest levels, beat goats. That does not mean goats is not viable. Goats is perfectly fine, especially if you're making adaptations, swapping one hero at a time in your goats to make it handle the counterplay that's come out to deal with it from specific teams. You can go very far as a team that specializes in goats. Obviously, you can't strictly play goats. Otherwise, welcome to Gibraltar. Have fun. You do need to be able to play dive for high ground maps, but you can have your identity as a goats team, like an Eagle Gaming, for example, and you can be perfectly competitive right now, even with Sombra and Doomfist working themselves in more effectively there. So that's kind of where we are now. That's how we got here, and it's an interesting meta. We got here, we have our meta, we have our goats versus dive scenario, and ultimately dive has one back out. I do just kind of want to highlight for everyone in case they missed it. It was just a couple weeks. For the best teams, for the teams that could read the meta and were coached well, it was just a couple weeks that dive wasn't meta. Dive was back to being king within a couple weeks after Briggs' release, and even when we had that other patch that, buffed 2 of GOAT supports and nerfed what at the time were the dive support pair by nerfing Mercy a little bit, since dive at the time was primarily using Mercy Zen. Now it's moved over to Ana Lucio, sometimes Ana Zen. I actually think the Ana Zen thing is really greedy. I understand why it's coming out when you expect to be playing into goats, because goats have so much trouble punishing the fact that Ana and Zen can't peel for each other very well. I think that's pretty greedy, though, if you don't strictly know that the team is running goats at you, with a few exceptions. Defending Gibraltar, you can generally get away with it because there's so much high ground to abuse. Even against a dive team, you get to effectively use the high ground as additional peel. A couple things like that. Nimbani first, same thing. But overall, Ana Lucio is really the better comp there right now. So that's all I'm going to cover here. If you like my content, stay tuned, subscribe for more, and I look forward to seeing you more.